And hello, everybody. Welcome to the Most Important Conversations. September, good to see you as always.
Likewise. Thank you.
We were just talking before we started the recording about stuff that I've been going through and some of the challenges that I've been experiencing in my own life. And you said that, hey, we should talk about you today. And I thought, okay, we can talk about me. So I'm always interested in trying to share, with other people, things that I'm downloading and observing and learning and reading. But sometimes, I can get lost in the noise of all that. So where would you like to start? I'll let you kind of guide and ask the questions, and happy to transparently answer whatever you're asking and whatever shows up.
Well, as we were talking, the question is always before we start recording, we go, okay, what are we going to talk about today? And what came out of the conversation that we were having prior to the question was, let's talk about the uncontrollables, those pieces. We were talking about COVID and how COVID, I, from my own perspective, not that this is fact, but this is a perspective through my own lens, is that COVID brought this awareness to people that they cannot control everything. There's certain variables and things that life will bring to us that are way outside of our control, way outside of our prediction. And I think that that's created a level of awareness in people that I believe many people are experiencing as fear, and they don't really have the words to it. And I would say what I would replace the sensation of fear with is the awareness of like, oh, I'm just aware that life can throw not curveballs just in my life, but as an entire globe. The entire world experienced this thing at the same time, and it came out of nowhere. It was left field. Nobody could predict it. And so that led us into the conversation where you were talking about a project that you're working on, that you've poured 5 years of your life into. And you were sharing kind of just in what I would call an off day around that particular project. And I'm super intrigued to, one, talk about you today, because, you're very interesting. And I'd love to share more of you with our listeners and who you are. I have the pleasure and the honor of getting to know you over the 4 years of really working closely together, even though we've known each other for quite much longer than that. We've worked closely together for the past 4 years, and it's just been a total joy getting to know you and to see who you really are. And I want to share that with our audience. And it just so happens that the perfect topic is the uncontrollables, the variables. And the last thing that I would like to say is when I think about that piece, you've raised money for businesses for a long time, and preparing that presentation, you think, what bedtime story do I need to tell around this? Because there are so many things that we can't control in business, and we cannot predict how things are going to perfectly lay out, which they never do, by the way. So yes, let's start there with the project and what happened yesterday. How did you navigate through the day? First of all, what was the day like for you, and how did you navigate through all of that?
I'm involved in various projects, most of them in tech, and have been for, I don't know, 16 years now. And there's something I've been experiencing and observing over the last 2.5 years, actually pertaining to a couple projects. There's one that I'm very involved and emotionally, I realized yesterday, emotionally attached to seeing succeed. But there's been others where I've experienced the same trend. There's actually a couple projects that I'm helping with right now on the capital front, on the structure, the strategy, all kinds of different areas. And I've been noticing that the last 2.5 years have been probably the toughest capital markets in terms of helping to raise capital and moving things forward that I have probably ever experienced. And for a while, I was thinking, is this just like my experience, or is there's an actual thing going on in, how people are relating to money and investing and, excuse me, what does that look like? I've talked to some friends of mine who are investment bankers and are, do far more of this than I do, quite frankly, because I only get involved in the investment side of things when it's a project I'm involved with, but it's not my business to be and I'm not an investment banker. I don't raise capital for a living. So it's only if I'm a founder or part of a project that we get involved in those types of conversations. So people who do far more of this than me, they might be raising money for 15, 20 companies at a time. I've never had that experience. But they have, much more of their finger on the pulse of like what's going on right now. So I reached out to a couple of those friends over the last week, and I just said, what is going on? Like, we're having a hell of a time with this project, with this one, raising capital. And specifically what's happening is we work with the investors right to the line. They go through due diligence, they go through contracting, they sign, and we get to the moment of, okay, here's the wire instructions, and they either disappear or change their mind, and at least have the courtesy to tell us that they've changed their mind. But actually, more often than not, nothing happens. They just disappear. And like, I've been noticing this over the last 2.5 years. And for, a few projects that I've been working on, we've raised on paper hundreds of millions of dollars, and the money hasn't come across the line. And I'm like, well, what's going on with this, right? So I asked my friends who do this for a living, and they said, oh yeah, you're experiencing a weird phenomenon. Like, it's not just you, it's happening all over the place right now. And so I started, actually, Jenna and I, on a recent podcast we just did, we're talking about this very phenomenon as well. And we were talking about in the context of fear, which is kind of what you were just bringing up, and, the uncontrollability of the world. And so, yeah, when, I think what's happening and it's not just in the capital markets and raising money, it's happening in all sectors. So we had this trauma event collectively called COVID. And whenever human beings have a trauma event, they either, if they're practicing emotional sobriety, which we teach in whole life architecture, then they're setting themselves up to have more power and autonomy to move through that from a place of power versus being a victim of it. But most people don't have that awareness. They don't practice emotional sobriety. They've never been taught it. They're not working with us in whole life architecture and TMIC to learn it and to be able to apply it to their life. And so they end up using, to the best of their ability, the tools that they've learned kind of haphazardly over the course of their life to try to deal with the trauma of an event like a once in 100-year pandemic. And those tools typically don't work very well, because those tools are usually obfuscate, repress, ignore, distract. I can't tell you how many times during COVID I heard people saying, oh, if we could just get back to, quote, normal. So normal being pre-COVID, right? Sort of 2019 before. And then even coming out of COVID, there's this sort of like, oh, we're going to get back to normal. We're not back to normal. We're in a new normal. And how we lived and who we were before COVID is never coming back again, because we had 2.5 years of new stuff being experienced in our bodies, in our minds, in our emotions. And, actually, Jenna brought up a really great example. We were talking about sort of the capital market. She's like, the behavior of when everyone was hoarding toilet paper. And she's like, now they're hoarding money. It's just same mechanic. It's the toilet paper thing. It's just money. And why? Because money is a sense of safety, security. And if the unknown were to show up again, at least I have the money to do something about it. Here's the problem with that. When fear grips us to the point where we are no longer investing in new ideas, we're no longer investing in creation, we are no longer investing in what's possible, life gets really small. And we're seeing that around the world right now, even in our politics. You're seeing this contraction happen. In 2019 and everything before that, we were in this sort of globalized world. We had supply chain. We still have it, but it's starting to break apart. We had supply chains all around the world, distributing products and goods and services or whatever. And we saw ourselves as global citizens, or at least a lot of us did, especially if you're in the entrepreneurial space, where I know you spend a lot of time, in the capital markets. People who invest in good ideas don't really care where the ideas are. So they have a global mindset. You just invest in ideas that are solid. We had this global mindset, and we don't have that right now. What we have is a contracting mindset of, this is my country and everyone get away, right? It's like, this is my toilet paper, everyone get away, right? It's the same thing. So forget the topic. It's the same thing. The whole thing right now, what we've been going through around the election and the politics over the last few years and everything has been a large portion of the population. I mean, it's not just the United States. You're seeing it in Europe, in places like Germany, the UK, this contraction happening, right? In Australia, you're seeing it in Canada and other places around the world, where it's like, let me just protect mine and my own. And that's like the hoarding of the toilet paper. Well, my family will have toilet paper because I just bought, 50 bags of it. And just as a side note, that was like the weirdest thing in the world, right? Of all the things you could hoard, right? I mean, why toilet paper? But anyway, that's sort of a side note.
COVID didn't even give you symptoms that you would even need that much toilet paper. It was that kind of flu.
Yeah, like I'm thinking of like, what else could you have hoarded that would have been more productive than toilet? How did that happen? I mean, that was just one of the weirdest things. I remember thinking, there's other things you could probably hoard, but hoarding in and of itself is not a good behavior. It's a behavior that stems in fear, right? And not having enough, not being in control. And so we're not hoarding toilet paper anymore, but we're hoarding other things. We're hoarding money. We're hoarding opportunity. We're hoarding goods and services, and we're contracting right now. Nothing ever good comes from contracting. It's a survival response rooted in fear, and it just shrinks you into a smaller and smaller and smaller world. And eventually, just like the universe, you compress so tiny and so tightly, a big bang usually follows, an explosion of creativity. So from my perspective, the good news is we're on track for an explosion of creativity. When? I have no idea. It's when people eventually feel so confined, so trapped, so contracted, so suffocated by their own fear response. And then this is sort of leading to what you wanted to also talk about today, which is what I went through yesterday. So I was going through this very same, on a microcosmic level, this contraction. I was feeling like, gosh, what is it going to take to raise money for these projects? What is it going to take to get investors, and to follow through with their word and honor the integrity of their actions, and as though I have control over that, right? So that's where I found myself naturally drifting towards. And so yesterday, using the very tools that we teach in whole life architecture, emotional sobriety, perception is reality, the power of you as a creator, the power of attachment versus surrender, and detaching from these things, I came to the realization that my mind, I had fallen into a trap where my mind was thinking me about this thing. And so I had to pull myself out of it using these tools, so that I wasn't in the situation, but I'm on the situation, right? It's the difference between you like working in your business versus on your business. When you're in the situation, you don't have the vantage point to see properly. I needed to get a different vantage point. So I had to get some distance, which you do energetically, psychically, emotionally, but you have to use these tools. So I was able to do that just over the last, 8 hours, frankly. And I woke up this morning in meditation, and I was like, I'm too enrolled in this thing. I need to actually back away. Not like it's the projects aren't important to me, but I just need to back away from them and treat them as sort of this project I'm working on versus projects I'm working inside of. Because when you're inside of something, you can't distinguish you from it. It gets wrapped up. Suddenly you start taking things personally, right? So the investors that are being weird, they're dealing with trauma, they're dealing with fear, they're dealing with hoarding. It's not personal to me. It's not personal to the project. This is their own stuff. And we as a society have to move through this and heal this if we're ever going to get to the place where we will eventually get to, which is creating possibility again. So let's bring it down to what you wanted to talk about, and we can talk more about me and how I managed it or whatever, but the world is uncontrollable. It always has been, always will be. The idea that we drifted into pre-COVID, that gave us a sense of confidence. We were investing in things, we were taking risks, we were expanding in the world, whether as an individual, as a company, as a government, or whatever, right? It's just all different layers of scale, but it's all the same phenomenon. We were doing that because we were telling ourselves stories. We know from Joseph Campbell that humans are meaning-making creatures, and the way we make meaning is we tell stories to one another. So we were telling stories about our society, the American dream. It's a story. It's not a reality. It's not a reality. There's no such thing as the American dream in physical space. There's just your perception that this story is something you're going to live into. We have stories about everything, stories about our family, stories about ourselves. In an investment context, we create stories called business plans. These are stories. They're not reality, but we lulled ourselves into a place of believing that these things were real and we could trust them. And then COVID whacked us over the head, the uncontrollability of the world, and said, none of this is real. The only thing that's real is this viral disease you could catch and kill you. What are you going to do about that? Right? And we were suddenly realized, oh my gosh, we don't know what this is. We don't know what to do about it. We don't know how to control it. And the fear response, I think it's really disingenuous, just as a side note, for at least half our population to be these sort of quote unquote freedom fighters rebelling against the government because they forced us into a lockdown. The government, I'm not saying it was right or wrong. It was the government's fear response. It was, oh my gosh, we got to contract and contain this, right? And then there were other people like, you won't contain me. And it's like, guys, we're all trying to do our best in a situation that has not been experienced in 100 years since the Spanish flu. We're an interconnected globe now. We don't know how to deal with this. There was no, real action plan for this. And even if we had a plan, it's like Mike Tyson says, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. And we got punched in the mouth collectively. So anyway, I just wanted to say that we have to stop judging each other, both as individuals, stop judging the government, stop judging. And that's just more fear. Everyone's out to get us. No, right? We got to get out of this fear loop that we're in right now. And start creating again. And I think if TMIC is doing anything in this moment, it's creating a place where we can come together collectively as a community, as individuals, but still as a community, and we can create possibility for the future. That's the only way we're going to get out of fear, is to lean back into possibility, back into creativity, back into working together instead of seeing everyone as an other and the enemy. Right? That's just fear response. That's all that is. When you see an other and you think they're a threat, you're in fear. You're not in, and you can't be in creativity and fear at the same time. It's impossible. So in a way, TMIC is all about helping people move through fear back into their highest expression of what it means to be human. And that's creativity. And I needed to get to that place personally because I found myself contracting into, we're never going to raise money for these projects. And it was starting to blur my perception of what's possible. And so I was able to extract myself out of that. I feel much better today than I did yesterday.
On that note of feeling much better today than you did yesterday, how would you describe the sensation or the emotion? I tend to call emotions sensations because it's easy to separate it with the idea that, okay, my body's just having, my nervous system is creating a sensation, and the sensation feels like joy, or it feels like fear, or it feels like sadness. How would you describe your contraction yesterday before you had the awareness of, shit, I'm too far into it. I need to take a step back and get a different perspective?
The only way I could describe it was I felt like I was trapped in a tiny, tiny little box or a room, and there was no lights and there was no windows, and I couldn't see anything. And so I felt like I'm grappling around in this room, trying to find the door or the window to get out of the room. And there was no door and window. And so I felt like I was literally in a prison, you know, and it was a prison of my own perceptual making, because I'm the one who allowed myself. So it was a choice, even though it was very subtle and incremental. There were things going on along the way that I didn't nip in the bud fast enough. That where I moved from being the observer to the experiencer. And so these projects I'm working on, if I'm in the experiencer role of it, they feel very contracted and constricted right now because they're being affected by all the fear from the capital markets, the investor community, and all of this. Like tech has, like I said, all of my projects tend to be in tech outside of the work we do with TMIC. And tech has taken a beating over the last 2-3 years, just like the amount of layoffs, with Facebook and Google and all these big companies. We're in a tech drought right now. And it's because of the fear that's in the investor marketplace. But fear is all over the place right now in every area, not just in investments. And so, yeah, I felt like I was in this box, but perception is reality. So it was interesting. As soon as I was able to articulate to myself of how I feel, the awareness of I feel like I'm actually, that Bob Newhart on the Mad TV, the thing I always show, right? The woman shows up and she's like, I'm afraid of being trapped in a box. And the whole skit is he's like, well, stop it. Just stop it. Like, who wants to live like they're trapped in a box? So I'm laying in bed last night and I'm like, I'm feeling like I'm trapped in a box. And Bob Newhart, of all people, he was like, well, stop it. And I'm like, yeah, this is ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
And so thank you, Bob Newhart, for waking me up, because I was feeling like I was trapped in a box. And then I went to the tools. I went to the tools of emotional sobriety, perception is reality, attachment, surrender, all of these things we talk about in whole life architecture. And literally by the time I woke up and did my meditation, I was able to pull myself out of it and see clearly again. This is ridiculous. I am identifying my whole self with these projects and the success of them. And where my attention really needs to be is what I do control. The only thing we control is ourself and our response to things. So I was able to augment my response as opposed to being in reaction to what was going on around those projects. And my choice in my response was to pull back and refocus my energy, my intention, my effort into the things that I do have control over, which are not the capital markets, not the fear reactions of investors. I don't control any of that. And kind of to the bigger point you're raising, we don't control anything except our ability to respond. Our responsibility is directly tied to knowing the self and using the tools to stay connected and grounded to ourselves.
That was amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. There's a couple of things I want to break down for just a moment. I mean, you've been practicing this body of work a lot longer than I have. So I would say that I can, new learners of this body of work could resonate with the newness of what I'm learning in this journey as well, too. So I just want to reflect on something that you said, because we've mentioned this before in other conversations, that there's certain tools. One tool is that can help us along the way. One tool is getting connected to nature. When you're very stressed, you feel a lot of anxiety. If you've been in front of the computer too long, like when we host our virtual events, I always take a break halfway through to say, go stand outside. You got to get rid of some of this technology fatigue that we will experience when we're in front of a computer all day, and use the outside, use nature to ground you and to utilize that tool that we have in our universe. Another thing that you were just talking about, you didn't say it pointedly, but I want to point it out. that this is something you thought about before you went to sleep. Now, we've talked about before this. If we're dealing with something or moving through something, allow your subconscious to work for you while you're sleeping. Ask the question, what is the insight I need to have here? Show me clarity. Whatever the question is, ask the question of the subconscious mind and allow the subconscious to work through some of that stuff so that when you wake up, you have insight. The other piece and the other tool that you leaned into was meditation. We talk a lot about meditation. And I think everybody experiences meditation differently. For me, it's a way to connect to source energy. It's a way to allow my subconscious mind to purge itself at times. It's a time for me to be still and to feel connected to my higher self or to my truest self, my authentic self. So meditation, that was another tool that you pulled into. And then prior to the conversation, you were telling me that you and Tara were talking through some of these things. You have a partner, your wife, you have a partner, somebody in your life who understands this body of work, and you can bounce ideas and talk to people. And that's another tool that you utilize. The other piece I wanted to bring up, you've also talked a lot about cause and effect. And as you were talking about this story-making machine, right? Our brain is a story-making machine that we continue to make these stories up. That would be the cause. And the effect to that is that we create our own belief systems about things. This is whatever we believe is what we experience. So there's 8 billion different unique experiences going on in the world at this moment. And then what I layer on top of all of that piece, and what I'm hearing you say a lot of in between the lines of what you're saying, is that you have a belief within yourself that no matter what comes your way, you're going to be able to navigate through it. So there's the cause of the story that you create. Your story is, no matter what comes my way, I'm going to be okay. I got this. I'll figure it out. I'm resourceful enough. I'm smart enough. I know how to do this. And in turn, it's created the effect of this is your belief system that you have about yourself. So tying it all into the uncontrollables in life is that what I'm hearing you say as an observer of what you're sharing is like, this is how you've chosen to navigate the uncontrollables and the variables that life will throw our way, is leaning into a handful of tools to help us with our nervous system. I mean, essentially, that's what you were doing yesterday. You became aware that your nervous system was communicating something to you. I feel like I'm in a box. Okay. Thank you, nervous system, for explaining that to me. And then working together with, okay, I have the awareness that I'm stuck in this box. And then Bob pops in and he says, well, don't do that. Stop it. And like, it's just clicking for you. And I think that in this journey of growth and utilizing the body of ontology for the study and to learn more about ourselves, that you have found your recipe for dealing with things. And it's wonderful to hear what that recipe looks like for you. And I certainly hope that the people listening takes note and tries it on. And maybe you need something else. Maybe meditation isn't your jam. Maybe you need to go for a run, and that's your way of feeling grounded in life and grounded through what you're working through. So it's really wonderful to have you share all of that through your perspective of just grappling through normal life stuff that just happens, just because you may be a teacher of a certain body of work doesn't mean that life doesn't just happen to you.
Right.
Things are perfect because you got this, Chad. You know everything about emotional sobriety. And so it's refreshing to know that you too need to still practice and lean into these tools on a day.
Well, we're all human, and that doesn't change even if you've been, practicing, something for thousands of hours and years. And we all find ourselves caring deeply about things in our life. And when we get that emotionally attached to things we care deeply about, we can lose our perspective on things. And, but this is where the tools come in order to regain perspective, regain a sense of the ability to respond, regain a sense of control over yourself, because it's the only thing we control is ourselves. We don't control anything else. And so, but if you don't have tools, you're going to be at the whims and the victim scenarios of everything happening outside of you and around you. Like when I acknowledged I was feeling trapped in a box, and then Bob Newhart showed up, that was sort of, that's my own little kind of thing, because I always show that video. It's a funny video. but it triggered something for me. It was like, yeah, okay, I'm feeling like I'm in a box, and you have the tools, I said to myself, to get out of the box. Right. So remember, in my metaphor of what I was feeling like, there was no doors and windows. So there was no escaping the box. There was just me reconnecting to the state of I live in a no box state. So it's kind of a strange thing, right? Where there was a box and then there was no box. There was no escaping it. There was no need to escape it because there was no box to escape from. The fact that I was feeling was in a box was just a perception. It wasn't real, but it felt real. And for a lot of us, our trauma feels very, very real, right? And also, I want to say we mislabel too many things trauma these days, when there's some things that are just, Jen and I were talking about this as well. Some things are just stress, and it's normal to go through stress. It doesn't have to be trauma, right? But COVID was a trauma. And, it's like people like, oh, so-and-so is not texting me back. I'm so traumatized. No, you're not. That's not trauma. That's just them not texting you back and you blowing this way out of freaking proportion because you're too emotionally attached to an outcome, right? So, I think for me, where I started was I'm feeling like I'm trapped in a box, and the first thing I needed to do is create space from this emotional attachment that I now am aware is happening. So meditation comes in, and you mentioned going for a run. I'm a runner as well. Can be a version of meditation, can be. It's not for everyone, and it also depends how you do it. But basically, creating space and distance energetically, psychically, and emotionally from the thing you're attached to is step one, because you're not going to be able to work on something if you're still in it. So you've got to get outside of it. You've got to get some perspective and some distance from the thing that you find is really bogging you down. So for me, it was the narrative of I'm so in these projects, and I was, as soon as I started to relate to this is happening to me, is when I knew I was in the box. Because there's nothing that happens to you. That's a perception, right? There's just things happening and what you make it mean about yourself.
Going back to the storytelling.
Right. And we are storytellers. So what I did is I created some distance through meditation, and then I chose, as creator of my life, to create a different story, because none of it's the truth anyway.
No, but it certainly creates the reality that you experience, because we believe our stories are real.
We do.
And therefore, they create reality.
Right. And that works both to or not to our advantage, depending on our choice. Because we relate to our stories as real, if I am not the creator of my stories, then the stories of my life that I'm living into are created for me by others and by circumstances. And I relate to those stories just as real as if I'd created my own story. You hear this right now a lot in the culture, and it's accurate, but I just want to it's so nuanced. So I was watching the documentary last night about Simone Biles and her Olympic win, and it's a fabulous show. I encourage everybody to watch it. She's very inspirational because she's also dealing with the stories she can find herself getting trapped in this case about Tokyo Olympics. She leaves. Everyone calls her, a whiner, a quitter, whatever, right? This narrative, this story gets painted about who she is. And then she's going to Paris this past summer to the Paris Olympics. And she even says in the documentary, this was my opportunity to take my narrative back from everyone else, right? So she got stuck in a narrative of I'm a quitter. And she went through the grieving process, all the stuff emotionally she went through, and then made a choice. This is where you operate from power or victim. Victims stay in their story. Powerful people step out of it, realize it's just a story, and create a different story. And so she chose to create I'm reclaiming the story. I'm reclaiming the narrative. I'm going to go to the Paris Olympics, win it, because that's the story I want to tell about me, not the one everyone else was telling about me, right?
Mm.
So same kind of idea. Once you realize you're in the story, use meditation, use emotional sobriety, use the tools from perceptions, reality, and all the things we teach in whole life architecture to extricate yourself from it. And then we need a story to move forward, because humans are meaning-making, story-creating creatures. Create your new story. So that's what I did this morning. Like, okay, now this is the story I'm living into, not that. So, and it can happen as quickly as a day or less if you have the tools to observe, recognize, and then take the appropriate action.
I don't remember what I was watching, but what was explained, it was about attorneys, defense attorneys. And the guy was talking to, it must have been a show, because he was talking to a class and he was saying, and I'm paraphrasing, he's saying, everybody has their own unique experience about what happened. Your job is to paint a clear and a very clear picture of how your client's story is the reality of what happened. You've got to put facts to it and back it up. And I think in terms of what you're saying, a big piece, and I think it's important to highlight this, that when we change our stories, we need to have a certain level of belief in it, because it's the belief behind the story that makes it happen. You could have told yourself a bullshit story, but underneath of it, you really didn't believe it.
Yeah.
But you're still going to experience the thing that you believe, not the story that you're trying to convince yourself. There has to be a level of belief. So taking that idea that as a defense attorney, you have to paint the picture of what your client's story is. So in other words, you've got to look for the facts, right? So when like you see the red car, I want a red car. Now all of a sudden you see tons of red cars. So what is it that you really want, so that your brain can help assist you in finding proof that that is the reality and that that's what's existing? Yeah.
Yeah. And the other challenge we run into right now, especially with social media and everything, is this, and this is another podcast we should get into, but we should talk about at some point this whole world of quote unquote facts and truth and this kind of thing, because facts are simply mutually agreed experiences that we all concurrently point to and say, yeah, that is a thing, it's happening, it exists, or whatever. But in paying attention to some facts, we also ignore other facts that are inconvenient to the narrative we're painting, but they're equally a fact, right? They're just not facts that support the narrative.
And if you ignore that piece in experience, I just have to say, anytime I've ever ignored those pieces, it's come back to bite me, because I didn't want to notice it.
Right. So the best thing we can do is expose ourselves intentionally from a place of power to as many facts. Now, there are some things that are just not facts. I want to be clear that people make crap up too, right? That's not a fact, right? So that's also going on. So you need to be able to, this is a bigger conversation we'll have another time. How do we distinguish a fact from a fiction, number one? And then realizing that in the world of facts, okay, we put fiction aside for a second. In the world of facts, there are facts I'm going to pay attention to for my narrative, and there are facts I'm going to either intentionally ignore, or they're just not in my perceptual vision or field to even see, right? Which is why I believe we need each other. This is why TMIC's whole model is based on a group community-centric creativity model, because there are things you'll see, I won't see, someone else will see that someone else won't see. And we need access to as much data as possible to be able to make the best choices we can from an authentic, high-intention place. That's a bigger conversation. We could spend a whole hour just talking about that, which we should. But just in kind of wrapping it up today, the experience that I went through over the last 24 hours has done a couple things. One, it is reinforced the power and the validity of the work we're doing in TMIC and the Whole Life Architecture program, because if we were teaching this stuff to millions of people, which That's our intention, is to really scale this work out so people have the tools and the resources to actually handle life from a place of creator power, right? Versus victim powerlessness, which is where most people are, which is why. And how do you know if you're in a victim in a powerless state? You're in reaction to shit. That's how you know you're in the victim seat at that moment, because you
feel
not,
like life is happening to you.
Life is happening to you.
Yes,
That's when you know you're not in the position of creator. And so what happened to me in the last 24 hours allowed me to basically put the tools to the test again, which I had to do many times, but this was a really intense period for me. And they work. They just simply work, but you have to work them.
Yes.
Right. So
we got to build the muscle for them as well, too. I mean, how many times have I called you and said, okay, walk me through emotional sobriety again?
Yeah. You have to build it. Yeah. And the muscle is really one of your own emotional muscle, cognitive muscles through practice. That's why we practice them all the time in whole life architecture. And we're always in the dialogue, because it doesn't take long. If you were to disconnect from this work and just go back out into the conditioned world that people are in, it will not take long for you to, just by simple osmosis of being in that world. This is why we talk about being in the world, but not of it. And riding that line requires a connection to this work all the time, every week. That's why we do this every week, because otherwise you will find yourself in a position where the world is happening to you again, and it does not take long. Right.
Yeah. And the aspect of community around this particular conversation is really enjoyable, talking to other people and listening to how they're moving through and receiving it and applying the information and where they use the tools and stuff. It's really refreshing to get another perspective. It just feels like it opens up the peripheral vision a bit more of what's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, everybody. Hopefully that was helpful. It was a bit of a ramble share, but thank you so much for joining the Most Important Conversations. Thank you, as always, September, for holding space, and happy to talk more about me. And let's get into that more often as well, so that people can get to know where we're coming from and where our work's all about. But until then, everyone, we'll see you on the next episode of the Most Important Conversations.
That concludes this episode of the Most Important Conversations. This in-depth conversation could set you on the path to self-improvement, which is essential if you want to be an effective leader and take meaningful action in your life. If you enjoyed this episode and want more of these stimulating discussions, you can find them at TMICglobal.com. Remember, the world is at a crossroads right now. You can't afford to waste this opportunity to take charge of your life, build meaningful relationships with others, and co-create a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for listening. See you on the next one.